Hi, this is Joy at Pine Quilt Shop. Today we're going to talk about working with border stripe fabrics. I have a beautiful border stripe fabric laid out in front of me, and we're going to start by talking about how to cut your border stripe fabric. I will start by accordion folding it along one of the selvage edges. You can make as many accordions as you need to. You want to tier your accordions though, because you want to be able to see the front end of all of them. So I've got them lined up at my selvage. I'm going to give this a good shake to get those creases to kind of drop in place, the folds in my accordion. And I will lay this up on my counter. So once I have accordion folded it, and if I needed to, I could make more accordions. You can make as many as you need. But what you want to focus on is lining up some very definite part of your stripe, which for me is this dark blue. For your stripe, it's going to be a different area, but something that is linear, that is very easy to see, and that's what you want to focus on lining up between your stacked tiers. Now I can roll this back and spot check areas, and I will do that. I'll spot check to make sure that my accordion fold stacks are good, and I will do that one layer at a time. I'll lay it down. I'll start by checking my first layer, then I'll check my second layer. I'll spot check, like I said, a couple spots, and then I really focus on making sure that the front of all the accordion plates are lined up and are giving you a nice lineup on your stripe. So once you have your fabric folded and stacked and you know you've got a good lineup on it, then you can cut through multiple layers at a time. So to cut this particular border stripe, I would normally try to figure out an area where I have a little fudge factor. If you decide you're going to try to sew right next to that dark blue stripe and you end up off a little and you're a little bit over here, that light area is going to really show if it's showing in your seam allowance. If you try to sew right next to those beads, again, if you sew into them, it's going to really show. So I try to pick an area where I have, like I said, a little margin for error, and I would try to sew someplace out here in that medium blue section. Because if I'm a little off one way or the other, you're not going to see it. So I would take my strip cutting ruler. I have a nice dashed 1/4 inch line on this ruler, which I know is where my seam is going to be. And I would lay that down, and I'm going to lay it so I'm just a little bit past the dark blue part of the line, a little bit out into the light blue, because that's a good spot for me to sew. Oops, I'm off a spot there. Let me move that over. I'm lining up the wrong line for you guys. There we go. Okay, so there's my dashed line, and I'm lining it up just past the dark blue line, so it's a little bit out into that light area. And then when I go ahead and cut, I've given myself a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but I've placed it in an area where I have a bit of fudge factor when I sew. So here's where I cut. I'll lay that ruler down again so you can see where my seam is. My seam should end right at the edge of the ruler, and you see how I've tried to place it out in that medium blue area. So if I'm off a little bit this way or a little bit that way, it's not going to be noticeable, and that's how I normally try to cut my stripes. Usually with a border stripe fabric like this, you can pick and choose a little bit the width that you're cutting it at. So try to cut in a way that makes it a little easier on you. So once you have it cut, then you are ready to attach it to your quilt. So I have just a little sample topper that I made. I've got 3 border stripes sewn on it already, and I'm ready to add the last one. Now, when you figure the length of fabric that you need to cut your border stripe at, you need to make sure that you're accounting for not just the size of your project, so whatever the longest border is on your quilt, which is usually going to be your side borders. This happens to be a square, but whatever the longest border is on your quilt, you need to plan for that, plus the width of 2 border stripes, plus 2 to 3 extra inches on each side. So I am 18 here. I cut these at 8, so I need to do 18 plus 8 plus 8, and then I would normally add 4 to 6 inches to that because you need to have 2 to 3 inches extra, and I'll show you why in a minute. So you want to make sure that you have a little extra, and I put my hand underneath her so you can see how it's extending off the end. And the same thing over here, I've got a little extra. So when you go to sew your border stripes on, you want to make sure that you center it. Easy way to do that is to fold your border stripe fabric in half and to put a good crease in it. Fold your quilt top in half and put a good crease in it. And then line those creases up when you go to place your border stripe down and pin it in place. So you can line those creases up, and then you know that you've got it centered. And you do want to definitely pin this in place before you sew, so do make sure you center it. When you go to sew, I like to mark my fabric, and I mark it on the quilt top, and I will mark a little crosshair that is 1/4 of an inch in from both directions. And that is right where I want to stop sewing. This seam has already been sewn and it comes right up to that crosshair mark. When I go to sew this seam, I am going to stop right at that crosshair as well when I'm going this direction. Now when you're sewing seams to sew border stripes on like this, you want to make sure that you back stitch. You're going to be moving that stripe around and handling it, and you don't want to have stitches start popping loose. So I would start probably 3/8 of an inch in and back stitch to the crosshair and then sew forward. And I would do the same thing on the other end. I would sew up to the crosshair and then I would back stitch at least 3 or 4 stitches. So do make sure that you remember to back stitch, and you would sew that on, and you want to leave that little bit of a 1/4 inch opening, and you can see there where I stopped 1/4 of an inch ahead of where the seam line ends. So once you have all 4 of your borders sewn on, you are ready to start your miters. I tend to press out towards my border. That's how I like to press. So that is how I have pressed it. When I press though, I try to be careful to not start pressing seams in. I try to stop right at the beginning and end of that seam line when I press, but I normally press out towards my border. And when you go to do your miter, what you want to do is do this on your ironing board, lay the quilt out, get it nice and flat, and what you want to line up, and this is why you need that little bit of extra length, what you want to line up are the ends of your strip. And I'm going to put my hand underneath here so you guys can see that. It's hard to see on my whiteboard, but I'm lining up the strip, and the same thing over here. I'm lining up those strips, and if I've cut both of the borders at the same exact width and I line those tails up, I will have a very nice miter that just falls right into place. And there you can see my miter is just dropped right into place. It will just fall right in if you line those tails up. So those tails drive everything. They kind of make everything else drop into place. So I will line those tails up, and then I'm going to press with my iron. I'm going to have it hot. I'm going to use a lot of steam. I want to really set that crease, and then I will put a couple pins in the tail. And like I said, they kind of lead everything along and get the whole miter to drop into place. So I want those tails staying put. Put a couple pins in there, and then I will flip the top part of the miter back. And I've got a hand there holding it steady. I don't want my fabric moving around on me. And I will drop, depending on the width of my border stripe, anywhere from from 3 to 5 or 6 pins in, and I will pin right along the crease that I pressed. And at this point, all I need to do is to sew down that crease. Normally you can see the creases fairly well. It's a little harder on a light fabric like this. If you need to lay your ruler along the crease and run a quick chalk line, you can certainly do that, but you want to sew right down the crease that you just pressed. And if you do that, you will end up with a very nice mitered corner. So here's one that's already been sewn. You can see that I just sewed down that crease, and when I flip it open, I have a very nicely mitered corner. I always sew it first. I will come back and check that it looks nice before I trim that tail. And when I'm sewing these, I find it's easier to sew up into that corner. So I start on the outer edge, I backstitch, I sew down the seam, and when I hit that intersection, I backstitch again 3 or 4 stitches. And again, you are stopping 1/4 inch from the edge. So you're stopping right where those 3 seams are going to all come together. So start here, backstitch, sew down the crease, stop 1/4 inch from the edge, backstitch again, check your miter, make sure it looks nice, and then you can come back and trim that to 1/4 inch, and you will have a beautiful mitered border on your quilt. Thanks for joining us today.